Sustainable investments have been talked about now for a long time, but I really just want to start picking apart what is different about sustainable investments in emerging markets compared to what we might think about in advanced economies such as the UK.
Yeah, so let me address that by first setting the context that when you look at what Alibaba does, most of our investments are in emerging markets.
Right.
So I'm probably not as well equipped to talk about how we think about sustainable investing in developed markets as opposed to emerging markets. But let me give you a couple perspectives on how we think about it for the emerging markets. When you think about this question, two words come to mind. The first is adaptability, and the second is alignment. Let me deal with the second word first. The alignment is the sustainability objectives that we, Alibaba, has as a group that we try and deploy not only in our China business, but in all of our businesses around the world. And that's complicated because as we move to different countries have different objectives. So we need to align and figure out, are our objectives consistent, or can they be consistent with individual country objectives? Then the much more complicated part of this comes in achieving the balance and adapting the business model for all the people that we have to work with. So think about our business in any country as an ecosystem of partners. We have merchants, we have consumers, we have service providers, we have partners, we have digital and physical infrastructure. So that whole ecosystem also has their own set of interests. So thinking about all those interests and pulling them all together to balance them is really how we decide, can we achieve our sustainability objectives in each country that we decide to grow a business in.
Right. Thanks, Michael. I definitely want to come back to and think about some of those motivations, but Juan, let me bring you in here. Emerging markets and sustainable investing, is it different to developed economies?
First, let me start. Michael and I were talking before we came up here and express our gratitude to everyone for inviting us and be on the panel today. Thank you very much. Thank you, Your Excellency. It's a privilege for us to be here, so thank you. First of all, I think that definitions matter here, and we need to deconstruct definitions. Candidly, there are many things one can say about quote-unquote an emerging market, but I would posit for consideration that in many ways, the entire planet is an emerging market as we go through these radical transformations. And no country has to lead on these technologies that, frankly, suggest that they will be, quote unquote, the winner over the long term. Defining what is successful will be a mix of many considerations, including regulatory frameworks, right? Access to capital, education and available human talent, investment in public policy, and they all then lay the groundwork for a capital allocator such as us to then decide whether or not we want to enter that market. Because ultimately, one of the things that Michael and I share is the fact that we both are looking to achieve an investment return over a period of time. His is much longer than mine. Mine is defined by expectations of others. His is defined by their business strategy, their shareholders, and other strategic initiatives that they have. But in both cases, however, the expectation for return is there. And to do that, you have to understand the framework into which you are investing. If you do not understand it, you cannot do it. So it is really a partnership between governments, corporates, capital allocators, to then create a framework that allows for that capital to go in. And that ultimately decides where you deploy capital, whether you are in the United Kingdom or Brazil.
And that framework, you mentioned, is that a regulatory framework? I mean, or just, what is the importance of the regulatory framework of a particular market you're looking at? Why is that important? Is it the clarity? Is it the stability of the regulations in that particular market? So why is a regulatory framework so important?
I'll give an example here, and it's because we're in the UAE. Right now, one of the things that I think we'll be talking about later today is what exactly is the appropriate regulatory framework for large language models in artificial intelligence? Everybody is discussing this right now. Is it good? Is it bad? Who knows? Who interacts? The fact of the matter is, every region has a bias. in some ways. The EU will take an approach, the United States may take an approach, or 50 approaches. But the fact of the matter is, in order to have a successful creation and expansion of a business, you have to balance multiple factors. Candidly, here in the region, you have the best combination to potentially achieve that, because there is a forward-looking perspective on the potential of AI. They want to make money, which is important, but at the same time, they want to be socially responsible. How you balance those things will be very different in different markets, and how the things are then balanced will decide the success of it.
I will come back to Michael in a moment, but Juan, let me stay with you. I'm an economist. I've been
told
studying.
you we wanted to do this more.
No,
I'll come back. I promise I will come back. But I just want to focus on that return, and I'll get to Michael's motivations in a moment. But the return on investment is so important for investing, of course. Can you get a return on investment with sustainably focused investments?
Absolutely.
I'm skeptical.
No,
I want you to prove me wrong, but I think that's a challenge.
With two examples. We were the first institutional investor in Tesla many, many, many years ago. Now, candidly, when we led that work, we were not focused on quote-unquote sustainable investing, though we were focused on something that we thought would do good for the world, which is part of our mission. As a result of that, we looked very carefully at the drivetrain platform that was being built at the time, powered by batteries, and the ability of it to successfully scale out into markets and create an attractive business. So it was the attractive business that was first and foremost on our mind. Then it was nice to have the sustainable attributes, but always choosing a business that we thought could do good for the world. The second business, and I've got Keller in front of me. So Keller over here, who's now hiding, is a friend, but more importantly, well, not more importantly, equally important, he is also the founder and CEO of a company called Zipline.
Right.
Zipline will be talking later today. Zipline is transforming the logistics of delivery, and is so doing by using drones. It is investing heavily in both the technology around drones and the manufacturing of drones in order to fundamentally change how products are delivered to homes in a much more cost-effective and environmentally friendly way. Along the way, they've reduced birth-related mortalities in Rwanda, where they're trying out their products, as well as Nigeria and other countries, by 50%. Now, it's a great investment. But the mission, how it captures new technologies and changes the economics of that new technology, allows for great financial opportunity.
Right. Okay. So you proved me wrong. That's good. Thank you very much. No, it's fascinating. I think the important point is both your Tesla example and your Zipline example, there was a clear business model.
Exactly.
And then the sustainability outcomes are important, maybe equally as important, but still they're there. But you've got to have that fundamental business case.
Exactly. And the only thing I would add to that is, let's be clear. As a capital allocator, we are not making the decision on what the sustainability objectives are. What we're trying to understand is what's the policy around it and how it impacts the business model that we are supporting.
Right.
And the clarity around that then defines what we decide to do.
Juan, thank you so much. Michael, your motivations, again, we were briefly discussing 20 minutes ago. Your motivations are slightly different to Juan's about when you're looking at these different markets and thinking about investing. You're not, if I can paraphrase, not necessarily looking at the return on investment, at least not in the short term. Is that right?
I think
Or
we
slightly
don't, look
different to Juan's?
we don't look exclusively at return on investment, because the first question that arises when you start talking about ROI is over what time frame.
Right.
So if you ask our shareholders over what time frame, they may have one view. If you ask our business leaders over what time frame, we may have a different view. As we enter a market, we think very long term. The whole decision to enter the market is predicated on a view that if we build the business correctly and accomplish not only our sustainability objectives, but also our business model objectives, and the ecosystem can compete with both local and other international businesses, then we'll have a very good business and we'll make a very good return. So how do you model that out? The first thing you have to go back, I think what Juan said is right, is that you have to look at the regulatory environment, because if the regulatory environment doesn't allow you to bring digital infrastructure in addition to physical infrastructure.
What, bring in, do you mean? Bring into
bring
the
market? The technology into that market. Some markets have restrictions on that because they want to protect local, incumbent players, which is fine. But that has an impact on how we execute on our model. It also has an impact on whether there will be a good return on the model. The other thing is that, governments and regulators are very focused on what's happening to their consumers and what's happening to small businesses in their community. So if your model is only to bring products from somewhere else in the world and provide them very cheaply to consumers, that may actually be very interesting consumers, but very damaging to small businesses that are trying to develop in that community. So regulation will play a role in terms of determining, well, how do we think about the balance between foreign products and locally produced products? And there are many other examples of this that need to be taken into consideration, because if you're going to build this model for the long term, you can't keep changing it every 6 to 9 months. And we need to be sure that the regulatory environment isn't going to change every 6 to 9 months, because the models are not that adaptable. They can't be changed that quickly.
So you need a fair amount of certainty.
Yep. And we need a level playing field, because I think if the rules
against domestic players?
Well, you just need the clarity of how it's going to work. There may be an incumbent bias, which is fine. You actually see it in most markets. But you need to have the transparency of how you as a non-local player will be treated in that environment in order to make the investment, in order to be sure that your business model has a very good chance of being successful.
Michael, this is really fascinating to me, actually, because we're seeing a trend around the world of what's called industrial policies. Now, it's a very non-sexy term, right? And my group, the Economist Group, hates industrial policies. Most people who read the newspaper would be aware of that. But everyone's doing it. Everyone's doing industrial policies, and quite often there are some, maybe these are not compliant from the WTO perspective, but there are some sort of domestic preferences. Using local labour or using local content or that sort of thing. And so there are some barriers being put up when countries are understandably trying to develop their markets, their economies. But as a trade person, I worry a little bit about some of those trade barriers going up, which makes outside players have to jump through more hurdles, more hoops than they should. Are you seeing that?
Well, of course. The word onshoring.
Yep.
Means different things to different people, but I think in general it's let's make sure if something needs to be manufactured, we manufacture it here as opposed to buying it from a foreign market. Protects jobs, it's good for the economy. It may not be the best long-term solution, but it's very popular and you hear it everywhere. So we have to think about that issue. We have to think about other policy initiatives, industrial policy initiatives, and the way that they could impact our business. And so one of the things we've chosen to do, which is a little unusual for a Chinese company, is we partner. And partnering in a local market, we've done it here in the GCC. We're going to do it in the UAE. We've just finished doing something very interesting in Saudi. Local partners are very important to us. Partly, of course, because at one level, it's a validation. But at another much more important level, it helps to address industrial policy concerns, challenges, issues that we see today and that we don't know but expect could become problems in the future. And a local partner is basically an opportunity to keep you very tightly integrated in the dialogue about what's happening. You may not ultimately have the influence to change a policy or move it in a certain direction, but at least you know what's likely to happen long before the case would be if you're standing there by yourself and trying to interpret what's happening locally with no local representation. So this is a core part of our strategy for developing in every emerging market in the world.
Interesting. Okay, thank you so much, Michael. One, same sort of question, the challenges, the barriers that you see. It's not about naming names of certain markets or certain countries around the world, but as you look around the world and making investments and you need that return, what are some of the barriers or challenges that you're seeing? Is it the industrial policies? Is it changing regulatory frameworks? Is it uncertain politics? Right, politics change.
You know, I think we need to pull it back a little bit as we reflect on this. Why industrial policy? Why now? We've had industrial policy for a very long time, right? Different countries have had different initiatives. To me, it's a desire among many countries in a very multipolar world, increasingly multipolar world, to be relevant and ensure that there is an economic, as we go through this transformation driven by technology, there is an economic baseline for their activity in their home countries. And throughout the region and throughout the world, what we're seeing is the definition of strategic industries and how those industries will therefore be encouraged, including in the United States through the Inflation Reduction Act, candidly, Europe, elsewhere. The net effect of that is that it creates capital opportunities, but then it creates complexity because you need to understand the subsidies and how they may impact the ability to achieve a return given a playing field. I'll give you an example of this. So we're large investors in SpaceX. We have Starlink. Starlink is an incredible company. Starlink right now connects over 2 million people and growing very quickly, has a presence in the region. It would not necessarily be intuitive that you would build 3 or 4 Starlinks. Yet, for industrial policy and other reasons, people will do that. So then the question you then ask yourself is, okay, if there are several of them, what happens to the economics of that? In other words, what is your first mover advantage? What is the cost to deploy? What do I pay in fees? Who else is building? What will they subsidize? What will their fees be? What then becomes my market price? Then what then becomes my cash flow stream? You have to think through all of that. So it is just a recognition that the world is evolving in this way.
But this is what gives me cause for concern, right? That's a lot to go through. And I know you've probably been doing it for a long time and your experience and your colleagues' experience, but there's a lot of barriers there, right? And I guess what worries me about, again, the Biden administration, I do understand the motivation, I really, really do. But with such heft, attracting some manufacturing, particularly in the green energy space.
That's right.
Surely there has to be a disadvantage if you're an emerging market, say in Latin America, and you may have had some natural advantages in solar panels or something, and yet this huge Inflation Reduction Act happens in the US. That has to be a challenge for emerging markets when it comes to this area.
Absolutely, and he brings up Latin America because I spent a lifetime working in Latin America, privatizations and helping out with policy. The reality is, you want to evolve your economy from being, without naming names, a supplier of raw materials, and I'm now talking in a very limited way about Latin America, to the producer of value-added products.
That's right.
Right? To do that, you have to look at what competitive advantages you have. Ultimately, for me, as someone who promotes development in the region, the number one advantage we can develop is a regulatory framework that encourages investment, right, relative to the regulatory framework that may exist elsewhere. Here's the problem. If you do that, sustainability is not going to be the number one attribute that you're going to focus on, because ultimately what you're trying to do is reduce the cost of production, right, in order to incent people to come and use your market as a way to produce the products. But then you have to think through, from a public policy point of view, your trade agreements, because then you need to get the product from where you are to the next place. All of these things create a level of global competition that ultimately, because I believe the United States to be as much an emerging markets with all these new technologies as anywhere else. In fact, you could argue that the People's Republic is much more advanced in these technologies in the United States, and many of them. Ultimately, what will happen is that the people with the largest amounts of capital and the best educated people will win. That's basically where it's going to come down to.
Yeah.
It's reality.
Thank you. Michael, can I raise another point of concern? This is just me, sort of like, almost like therapy around.
They always come to me for the concerns.
Exactly.
Sure, go ahead.
So, again, I sit in the UK, love the UK, lots of rain, but great country, great people. We have a great person coming on the next panel, and a lot of respect for the UK despite the rain. So I look at the UK, I look at the US. I do see, which worries me a little bit when it comes to the sustainability agenda, a little bit of a pushback, not necessarily from certain governments, but at least people, some newspapers in society, particularly in the US, there is a little bit of a pushback now against the sustainability agenda. So at the same time we've got the huge Inflation Reduction Act changing the incentives, we have a bit of a political pushback in some advanced economies against sustainability. Is that a concern for emerging markets, or actually emerging markets can get on with it, investors can get on with emerging markets? Because I worry about these agendas or these narratives around sustainability infiltrating other markets and making it more complicated for investors to go and invest.
Well, I think we could have a lengthy discussion on why there is
We've got 8.5 minutes left.
pushback on the ESG initiatives, and I don't want to really get into that. Some of it is political and some of it
But is it a worry?
Maybe I can
broadly
help
speaking,
here.
is it a worry?
Maybe I can help.
Well, let me explain why. First of all, you're characterizing that as a sort of a developed world issue. But actually, emerging markets have their own form of that.
Right.
So let me give you an example. When you go to pick your favorite emerging market, but one that may have a relatively low GDP per capita. So many of the South Asian markets that we're building businesses in, if you go to them and say, listen, you need to make a contribution to sustainability by driving a hybrid or an EV. They say, well, that's great news, but I only make $1,500 a year, so I'll never be able to afford one unless you're going to provide all the financing. So it's not really that's their form of pushback. Or if you go to a small business and you say, you really need to focus on green manufacturing. I say, but I only have 4 employees and I have no capital and the local banks won't lend me money. So we see the same type of pushback, but in a different way. And I think of it as emerging market pushback on ESG. So that's the challenge. So what's the opportunity? So let me give you an example. In China, they have a business called Ele.me. It's a food delivery business, simple business, okay? So how do we think about a creative idea for sustainability for that business? So we go to the merchants, the restaurants, the food preparation people, and we say, please don't include any plastic utensils when you put the meal together. And then we also say to our consumers on our platform, so this is 1 billion consumers on our platform, okay? Please don't ask for plastic utensils as part of your food delivery. So I was looking at this the other day. We've delivered 1.7 billion meals recently, okay? No plastic utensils. So if you can do the same thing with plastic utensils, if you can take that and say, okay, what about the little boxes or the cartons and the bags that all of those meals are delivered in, and the electric bikes that are delivering them? You can take a very small thing and have a very big impact with no significant pushback from a consumer or a merchant. So I think a lot of the pushback, Western pushback on ESG is one thing. Maybe you should talk about that. But the emerging market pushback is also there. People can't afford it. They don't know how to change in order to meet these quote unquote ESG targets and goals that are being put out there. And so it's up to us to work with them to figure out what can we do working together, merchants, consumers, and our platform, to actually make a contribution at scale.
Right.
So what I wanted to suggest, by the way, I have a great idea for you in Zipline on sustainability.
No, I knew that's where you were going.
Yeah, I was going to go
Is that why you're sitting in the front row?
Yeah. So besides being a close friend, I had to have an audience of one, so I got him to show up. So what I was going to highlight is, there is a pushback to sustainability issues across the world. But it's not up to business to create these initiatives, okay? Business is about building a business. And when you're an entrepreneur, that's what you do.
So what can governments do then? If not for
So it's the governments actually set the baseline, right? When you are starting a business, and I have started one, I built a business, you're worried about getting your lease, paying your payroll, getting your first client, making sure your product works, your supply chain. That is what you're worried about. You're not thinking about appropriately, and this is where a company like Alibaba can be a leader. Okay, am I using plastic utensils, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the problem. If I need plastic utensils to win, and no one else is willing to give up on plastic utensils, then I'm not going to give up on plastic utensils. It has to be a common framework. And we work with governments, responding to governments, but public policy must come from the leaders, elected leaders, political leaders, whatever leader you have in whatever country you are, that set the policy for us to react. I think any assumptions around that is really not consistent with reality.
Right. Okay. Well, you're both doing a good job of giving me some more optimism. I sense more optimism here than I have. In the last few minutes, if we get invited back, that's a big if we get invited back and we're sitting here next year, what are some of the, do you see some progress? Are there certain examples you can point to? Is it plastics? Is it something else? Any areas where you think, actually, if we're here in 12 months' time, when it comes to sustainable investing and sustainable outcomes from investing, any areas we should look at that might really make progress over the next 12 months?
Well, it depends which markets, but Your Excellency, I'll give you an example here in the UAE. I think what you're doing with electric vehicles is very sensible. It bridges two concerns. The first is not everyone can afford an electric vehicle. So how are you thinking about dealing with that challenge? First of all, you're making it affordable for people to buy one. You're also, very importantly, putting the infrastructure in place, the charging stations, and the ability for people to have an electric vehicle, but not for it to be the most expensive asset that they own. And that will eventually get you to the 50% adoption target that you have in mind over the next several years. And so I think that that's a very sensible approach. I think there are other things that can be done and should be talked about, because I think that the challenge that we have is that ESG doesn't actually mean a lot to a lot of people. And so we find that we have 1 billion consumers, more than 1 billion consumers, and 10 million small businesses that we service. We can talk to them in a very practical way about how they, as part of our ecosystem, can work with us and us with them to achieve sustainability targets. And it makes sense to them because they see a growth opportunity. To your point, it's not killing their business, it's actually helping their business. And they can feel proud that they're also making a contribution, because guess what? Most of the people who are running small businesses, those 10 million small businesses, they have families, they have kids, they care what the world's going to look like in the next 10, 20, and 30 years. So if we can show them something that's good for them, good for their business, and good for their families, they're all in.
Great. Juan, any positive areas, any areas we should look for progress over the next 12 months?
You know, the world is going through such an accelerated transformation. There are many positive areas, much longer than the conversation we could have today, right? I mean, from how you apply artificial intelligence into companies, which, by the way, will have a sustainability component to it.
Right.
All the way through the implementation of new sustainable technologies around green initiatives. I mean, hydrogen is clearly a top-of-mind subject for me. The reality is, the reason sustainability is going to work is because it creates efficiency. The more economic sense it makes, the more it's going to work. And what we are all doing right now is working together to lower the cost of sustainability, show how it is a productive and operationally enhancing attribute, so that you can create businesses that employ lots of people and that have a future for those people. So I'm a big believer in sustainability, but it has to make economic sense.
Right. I think that's an excellent place to finish. I have been a little bit skeptical and then sharing my concerns, but I take Michael's point there at the end. I think case studies are really important. The more we actually share real life stories of companies, of people, that's, I think, is going to get through much more, in a much better way than broad concepts of ESG and that sort of thing. So anyway, it's been a wonderful discussion. Please join me in thanking Juan and Michael for this great panel.
Thank you.